Let's cut to the chase, have an honest conversation, and develop real answers. As a matter of fact, with Andrew Cuomo.
Hello, welcome back to As a Matter of Fact. I'm Andrew Cuomo. I hope everyone had a happy 4th of July. I know that I did. I spent time with family and some really good friends. We went to some great parties. I got out on the water, I did some fishing, and I avoided all the traffic, both ways, which is an art form in New York, especially in the summer when you're headed out to Long Island or if you're headed to the Jersey Shore or up north to upstate New York. It's the exodus from the city, but it was a great break. But while we were waving flags and marching in parades, celebrating our country and our freedom, our government, such as it is, was busy marching the other way. Unlike the Congress, which meets, makes noise, and accomplishes little, the Supreme Court made major changes, virtually all for the worst. The Supreme Court, as I'm sure you know by now, has come down with a number of decisions. They ended President Biden's student loan forgiveness program. They limited LGBTQ rights with private vendors. They limited interracial marriage couples with private vendors. And they ended affirmative action. Let's first take a moment to focus on each one. Student loans have been an oppressive burden on generations of young people for years. I know. I had those loans for years hanging over my head. Some people are paying $600 a month. Some owe $70,000, $80,000, $100,000, which they will be paying off for most of their life. Biden's plan was to forgive loans on a percentage basis based on need. The court said he needed congressional approval to do it. They could have been more direct, and the court could have just said they oppose the plan because they know Congress will never pass it. Biden says he's going to try Plan B. What's Plan B? It's to have the Higher Education Service Corporation pass a rule to allow forgiveness in special circumstances. Now, passing a rule is not as easy as it sounds. A rule has to go through Congress for comment. And there will be no doubt that this will be a war. And it will take months, if not years, to get it done, if at all. And all this after over 40 million Americans were told their loans would be forgiven. They must be crushed. You're at a sad place when you can't rely on what the President of the United States says. It's sadder still when you have a Supreme Court that is so clearly out of touch with the values of the American people. Let's forget the legality of the loan issue for a moment, okay? And let's take a longer view of the issue. Everyone says education is the key for our economy going forward. Everyone says an educated population is good for the country. Everyone says the next economy is the innovation economy and we need trained workers. Remember, at one time, this country was smart enough to understand that we needed to educate our people. And they offered free education through high school. It was a major social innovation. It happened in the mid-1800s. Well, that was high school. That was 150 years ago. And in many ways, today, college is what high school was 150 years ago. It is a threshold education to be a contributing member of society and to excel. Society is more complicated than ever. Every job is more complicated than ever. Why wouldn't you want to encourage people to get a college education? It helps all of us at the end of the day if you believe in the concept of community and a collective. Let's take the next case, the limits on the LGBT community and interracial marriages. That's probably what I find most disturbing and most anti-American. Now, a little background. New York State was the first big state to pass marriage equality. And passing marriage equality was a high point for the state of New York. And frankly, for myself personally, I remember the Pride Parade that year and the tens of thousands of people who turned out for it. One of the largest attendances ever at that parade. I have a picture that I keep to remind me of it. I remember the joys, the shouts, the cheers. I remember the tears of joy. People who had lived in the shadows for so long were now affirmed by their government. They were equal in every way. Marriage equality was not about marriage, I used to say. It was about equality. I used to joke that I was not recommending marriage per se because I was divorced. But my motivation was to ensure equality. It was discriminatory not to allow gays to marry. Now, it was very controversial, and it was unpopular at the time. It was a major dramatic social change. It was opposed by the Catholic Church and many, many conservative groups. And it was probably the toughest legislative battle I ever fought. In fact, it was my first year as governor, and the marriage equality vote had been raised 2 years before and had failed overwhelmingly. It failed because many Democrats voted against it. To pass it, we needed all the Democrats and some Republican votes to achieve a majority. Now, I pushed the Democratic legislators very hard. I asked them what they thought it meant to be a Democrat. I understand from a legislator's point of view, you try to avoid difficult or controversial votes, right? Politicians make friends, not enemies. But at one point, you have to stand for something. And at one point, you're there for a point of principle. And what does the Democratic Party stand for, if not equality, if not fighting discrimination? After a long few days, we got every Democratic senator to vote for it, many begrudgingly. Now, in retrospect, they will all say, oh, I'm a longtime supporter of marriage equality. But that's politics. I also enjoy that the pundits now say that I was tough to deal with as governor. I was. You have to be if you want to get the job done. I had to meet with every individual Democratic senator to make sure they were going to vote yes. At the time, they called me a bully for pushing them to support it. The truth is, if I hadn't done it, it would have never passed. You can call it bullying or you can call it leadership, but it is making government work for the people to do good things. I can't tell you how many lives have been changed because of marriage equality. People who have now married and are couples, people who now have families and children. And how different this is. I was talking to my daughters about this, who obviously grew up at a different time. But when I grew up in the 70s, I had good friends of mine who were gay. I know what they went through. Their lives were so hard. Their families often rejected them. They felt different. They felt isolated. They felt alone. They felt alienated. Many moved away because they just didn't want to answer the questions anymore. Many died of AIDS anonymously before the nation would even admit it existed. Their life was hard, and I was committed to make a difference. And we did. And that's what government can do. And that's what government must do. I remember one man approached me right after marriage equality passed. He was a big guy, slightly gruff, and he grabbed my hand. And it was a big hand and a calloused hand, and he held it tight. And he looked me in the eyes, and he said that his son had come out as gay 5 years ago. and that he was very upset and he was embarrassed by his son, and that he hadn't talked to his son in 5 years. But he said, "I'm with my son today, and I shouldn't have needed you, Governor, or the government to tell me that my son being was okay, but I did, and I thank you for it." And his eyes filled with tears. The fact that the government as a collective voted to pass a law which in many ways lifted the burden from every individual because it was a social standard. Of course, it was legal. There's no debate. I remember attending Mass with my children the week after I signed the marriage equality bill, and the priest lecturing the congregation on the tragedy of what I had done. I walked out in the middle of his homily with my children. I remember devout Christians condemning me to hell for violating God's will. But it was not God's will, in my opinion. It was their interpretation of what their God would will. My God is a God of love. My God says, "Judge, not lest ye be judged." A priest, who was a great friend of mine at the time and has since passed, had a great expression that said it all. God loves everyone, no exceptions. Perfect. We had done a great thing. It was a massive change, and a change that was hard. Change is normally hard. And politicians are afraid of change, and they are afraid of controversy. But we had gotten it done. One step closer to the eternal promise of equality. So with that as a backdrop, today we take a step back. And now we cast doubt on that equality. Because equality is not in the judgment of every person. Equality is a collective social decision. Today, the Supreme Court says that people can make their own decision as to whether or not there is equality. That's not equality. That is not what the Supreme Court found just 8 years ago when they made marriage equality the law of the land, because to do so otherwise would be discriminatory. That's what the Supreme Court said 8 years ago. My heart grieves for the LGBT community and their families. How about the children of the LGBT families? How will they interpret this? I assume they've spent their lives trying to avoid being seen as different. And now this, from the highest court in the land. How about allowing discrimination of interracial couples? Interracial marriage was decided in 1967 by the Supreme Court again. And we have made great strides to acceptance and realizing Martin Luther King's dream to judge by content of character and not color of skin. And today the Supreme Court says, in essence, you can discriminate by color of skin. We have such racial tension today after the George Floyd murder, the civil unrest, and now the Supreme Court chooses to highlight racial differences. And when the Supreme Court says a private vendor can make their own decisions, they're saying it's not the law of the land. They are saying it's up for debate. They are saying it can be a difference of opinion. They are saying individuals have a right to choose and discriminate. It's just another factionalization of this country. More division, more isolation, more alienation. And of course, all of this comes after the damage the Supreme Court did in the Dobbs decision on abortion. Again, a view held by the minority of the nation. And again, a deeply disruptive, divisive decision. Dobbs was opposed by a majority of the Republicans. This is a Supreme Court that has a megaphone that it uses for the conservative minority in this nation. Now, let's be honest. This was all planned and premeditated and executed by the ultra-conservative Republicans. They knew that the Supreme Court ruled the land, more so than any one president, and that the Supreme Court ruled the land for decades. So they focused on the Supreme Court. They made nominees pass the litmus test. We all knew it was coming. We all knew it was a looming danger, and they got it done. Democrats in Washington need to think long and hard about how this happened and how they let it happen. You know, Republicans are goal-oriented, and they are ruthless. Well, you know what? Maybe it's time Democrats fight fire with fire before the entire House burns down. What do these decisions mean at the end of the day? Well, you've heard all the analysis over the July 4th weekend. While we were all waving flags, I looked up at the flag and I wondered, what does that flag represent today? These were not just separate decisions. They were life-altering for many and defining for the nation. Well, some say they're just individual decisions, and they won't count for much. They're wrong. Dot, 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 connect the dots, and look at the trajectory. Look at the direction they're taking this country, and it is a frightening place. Look at what the Supreme Court has done to the United States. Look what it's done to our basic values. They've restricted freedom for millions of Americans. They've imposed a conservative religious doctrine that is in many ways now governing this nation. The same party that holds high the Constitution has basically said there is no separation between church and state. The state must live by the church's rules, and by the way, their church is the church that rules. Look at what they've done. They've taken away a woman's freedom to control her own body, freedom of choice. They've limited one's right and freedom of sexual orientation. It's no longer the law of the land. It's up to individual decisions. They've limited access to education, which was supposed to be the great equalizer in society, right? Education was the great democratic advancement. And they have furthered the racial divide between blacks and whites. In essence, they question whether blacks and whites should marry. Why shouldn't they be able to marry if they were equal? And why does anyone have a right to question that marriage and that equality? Look how damning a statement they made. This nation does not accept the universality of the right for blacks and whites and the LGBTQ community to marry. That's what they're saying. Their love is not equal, period. Now, I am sure that is their conservative religious belief. I'm sure that's how they would want their children to choose to live. I'm sure that in their family, they would condemn anything else. But don't impose your religious beliefs on the nation. It's bad enough you impose it on your own family, in my opinion. Think of the arrogance of the Supreme Court, changing decades of precedents when they all swore under oath they believed in stare decisis and how the courts should be consistent. They lied when they went before Congress. They lied to get the job. How ironic. And now this court, mired in scandal and controversy, mired in hypocrisy, judges the morality of the American citizens. Let Justice Alito take a good look in the mirror and judge himself. I dare him. What if Alito was standing on the other side of the bench? What would he say about his character and his behavior and his ethics? This is not politics as usual. This is not going to be remedied in the short term. The Republicans knew what they were doing. They put young people on the court so they would have decades of control. So yes, it's about electing a Democratic president who might be lucky and have selections for the Supreme Court. But I think it's more than that. These Supreme Court judges are going beyond interpreting the law in many ways. They are judging and imposing morality and personal values. They are imposing God's will, and they impose their God's will, not my God. And they are changing the DNA of this nation. Look at the vision that they are imposing on the nation. It's not positive, it's not inclusive, it's not uplifting, it's not affirmative, it's not inspirational. It discriminates by sexual orientation. It discriminates by race and discourages racial harmony and equality. It denies access to opportunity and hope. It denies assistance to people who badly need it. It denied women's freedom and choice over their own body. What do they do to uplift and move this country forward? Nothing. Theirs is an angry, exclusionary view of America. And they do this at a time when they know the nation is divided and pessimistic, and they add fuel to the fire, fuel to the racial division, fuel to the economic anxiety, fuel to the alienation so many Americans are feeling. They add fuel to the distrust of government. I said it before, and I'll say it again, because we have to hear it. When the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, a Democrat, indicted Donald Trump, 76% of the American people said it was politically influenced. The majority of Democrats said it was politically influenced. The majority of Republicans said it was politically influenced. 76% of the American people said it was politically influenced. You don't get 76% of the American people to agree on anything. And one of the only things that we agree on is that the justice system is politically corrupted. Lady Justice, holding the scales, but she's peeking through her blindfold, and she's tipping the scales of justice. Why do you think Trump keeps getting indicted and his numbers in the polls keep going up? Because no one believes the justice system is anything but political. And the Supreme Court is the highest level of a politicized justice system, put in place by a hyper-conservative Republican philosophy to do the bidding of the hyper-conservative Republicans. It is a perversion of everything we stand for as a country. We wave the flag, red, white, and blue. This is about what that flag represents. I urge Americans for a new spirit of activism and outrage. I don't care if you're not that excited about the Democratic candidates who are running. I really don't care if you don't think they're the best thing since sliced bread. Be excited because the Democratic Party fundamentally represents a different view than the dominant hyper-conservative view that is now making major decisions about our lives. But at the same time, hold the Democratic Party to its traditional beliefs and make it deliver, make it be effective, make it make change. Remember, this Democratic Party was not about boutique academic elitist propositions. The Democratic Party is not really about the woke movement. It is about waking up and realizing that we are losing the fight, and the fight is not about trivial cultural issues. It is a basic fight for freedom. Freedom of choice, freedom of sexual orientation, freedom of racial equality, freedom of opportunity for all, freedom for a quality education. That's what we are dealing with today. That is the question we're faced with. They are limiting our freedom. How ironic. The Republican Party, that loves to claim the American value of freedom, has actually limited freedom more than any time in modern history. When they say freedom, they mean freedom to live the way they think we should live. But my friends, that is not the definition of the word freedom. The fight is ours to make, and we must. Thank you for listening.